welcome back, Retro Rads, Digital Dreamers, and Pixel Pushers, to another episode of Jay's Retro Toys and Games. Sit down, grab a juice box, and blow the dust out of your mental cartridges, because today we are taking a deep dive into the absolute peak of 1980s digital adrenaline. I'm talking about a game that pushed the absolute boundaries of what silicon and copper could achieve. A game so intense, it didn't need a fantasy backstory or a space alien invasion to grip the youth of the world. Today we are chronicling the history, the drama, and the absolute geometric supremacy of Activision's 1980s masterpiece, Checkers. Today on episode number 132 of Jay's Retro Toys and Games. Welcome, everybody, as they say, to episode number 132 on this Thursday, June 18th, 2026. I'm your host, Jason DeCanio. 3 days to Father's Day, and when we get into the next week, we'll continue our look at more Activision games in this fifth season that holds pretty much the entire summer, because when we go into September, we go into the sixth season. That's kind of interesting, right? That we have a shortened fifth season with a lot of games to cover, and we'll still go into season 6, long season, full year, from September to June like we always do. This is kind of like a half a season, but it's still counted as a season, even though we are shortening our summer season because of the hiatus of every other game that we're looking at as well. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at Checkers. Before we can understand the sheer unadulterated madness of Activision's Checkers, we have to understand the bleak landscape of late 1970s entertainment. So imagine a world where if you wanted to play a board game, you had to physically open a cardboard box. You had to endure the agonizing emotional trauma of realizing your little brother had eaten half the red plastic round pieces, or that the dog had chewed up the board itself. Now, you were forced to use your own hands to physically slide a piece across a grid, risking carpet burn or a tragic fingernail tear. The human race was suffering. The Atari 2600 had arrived to save us from our television static, but early game developers were obsessed with space rocks and digital tanks. Nobody was answering the cries of the millions who desperately wanted to jump over another red circle and yell, "King me!" in a completely empty room against a silicon brain. Well, enter the heroes of our story. In 1979, 4 legendary programmers grew tired of Atari refusing to give them credit or royalties for making hit games. They broke away to form Activision, the world's very first third-party video game developer. These guys were rock stars in leather jackets, armed with nothing but assembly code and an appetite for destruction. And they looked at the Atari console and said, "We can make this machine sing." And while the world expected them to unleash laser beams and racing cars, programming wizard Alan Miller looked into the future and saw the ultimate battlefield, an 8x8 grid of alternating colored squares. Miller knew that to truly conquer the living room, Activision had to digitize the ancient, brutal blood sport of checkers. So when Checkers dropped in 1980, it shattered everyone's perception of reality. Let us talk about this visual fidelity of this absolute powerhouse. The game presented players with a stark, hyper-realistic blue background, and on this digital canvas sat a checkerboard rendered in glorious shades of green and gray. The pieces themselves were not just simple circles, they were intricately designed squares with little squares inside them, pushing the limits of the Atari's television interface adapter. If you squinted hard enough, it looked exactly like the plastic pieces sitting on your grandmother's rug, except these pieces glowed with the forbidden light of a cathode ray tube. It was a visual feast that practically screamed, "The future is now, and it is mildly pixelated." We cannot talk about Activision's Checkers without discussing its groundbreaking audio design. There was no orchestral score. There were no heavy metal guitar riffs. Instead, the game treated players to an avant-garde minimalist soundscape that captured the existential dread of competitive board games. When you moved a piece, the television emitted a sharp, authoritative boop. And when you jumped an opponent's piece, the console rewarded you with a satisfying, crunchy bzzz. It was audio engineering at its finest, designed to stimulate the dopamine receptors of every child who had skipped doing their homework just to stare at a glowing green grid for 4 consecutive hours. The true brilliance of Checkers lay in its revolutionary artificial intelligence. Alan Miller programmed 4 distinct levels of difficulty. Level 1 was essentially playing against a digital toddler who occasionally forgot the rules of physics. But level 4? Level 4 was an omniscient, cold-blooded grandmaster trapped inside a black plastic cartridge. Playing level 4 was a masterclass in psychological warfare. You would make a move, and the Atari would sit there, dead silent, computing its next devastating counterattack for up to several minutes. The tension in American living rooms was palpable. Kids would sit cross-legged on shag carpets, sweating profusely, waiting for a computer chip with less memory than a modern toaster to systematically dismantle their entire defensive strategy. And as the years rolled on and the video game crash of 1983 wiped the slate clean, Checkers faded into the mists of nostalgia. It was replaced by plumbers jumping on turtles and hedgehogs running at supersonic speeds. But true aficionados never forgot. And Activision's Checkers proved that you didn't need a massive budget or a Hollywood voice actors to create a timeless masterpiece. You just needed some solid code, a dream, and the ability to make a boxy cursor jump over another boxy cursor. It remains a monument to an era when video games were simple. Living rooms smelled like microwave popcorn, and getting kinged was the highest honor a human being could achieve. So the next time you're playing your fancy virtual reality headsets or your hyper-realistic battle royales, take a second to remember the green and gray grid that started it all. Thanks for stopping by the shop. Keep your controllers unentangled, and I'll see you next time on Jay's Retro Toys and Games. Have a great weekend, because episode number 133 is coming up on the 23rd. And that is after Father's Day, so we hope you will have a fantastic Father's Day. Play some checkers with your father. And I don't mean the Activision version. Go out there, set up the board, and have some fun. And remember, of course, your father did a lot of things for you. Don't also forget God the Father himself. For Jay's Retro Toys and Games, I'm Jason DiCanio. Have a great weekend. Bye for now.